And we're live. Good day, Whiskey Brothers and Whiskey Sisters, and welcome to the Whiskey Book Club's 5th book review, The Language of Whisky. This one right here by David McNicoll. As always, we're honored to have you, the viewer, with us today and our panel. My name's Cliff. I'm the president of the Alberta Scotch Society, founder of the Whiskey Book Club, and I'm your host tonight. For those of you that are a little bit new, I'll explain what we're about. We're a group of whiskey geeks that love to share a dram and share a passion for reading, mostly about whiskey or whiskey-related activities. The choice of our 5th book, and I'll put it up, is a return to our roots. We spent months and months on Canadian whiskey, a bit of time on bourbon, and it's now time to get back to some Scotch. So, the common thread, though, passion for reading, mostly about whiskey. I hear someone's in the background. Myself reverberating. Our common thread, no matter what we do, is our love for whiskey and our desire to try something new. So I mentioned this before in the short video introduction, but it bears repeating. Our guest tonight, David McNicoll, the author of Language of Whisky, is first and foremost, he's a whiskey aficionado, born and raised in the Highlands, went to the University of Aberdeen, worked at Blair Athol, owned a travel company called Scottish Roots, which specialized in this really cool in whiskey and ancestral travel. Moved to New York 10 years ago, and he's been a brand ambassador for several brands. Kilhoman, Penderin, I think is the other one. And he teaches all things Scottish at the Brooklyn Brainery. So I'm sure I missed quite a bit, but we're going to get to know him really well over the next couple of weeks. So we're going to start us all off with our roundtable introductions. Please include your name and what you're drinking tonight, ladies and gentlemen. We're going to start with David, and then we're going to go in alphabetical order with Dave, Don, Drew, Sheila, Kent, Nicole. Sound good? So
is Don there?
You're up, David.
Hey, hi, folks. Nice to be part of this, and thanks for having me on, Dolphin. It's going to be great talking to you guys about all things whiskey and a little bit of Scotch as well. So thank you.
Our pleasure having you. And we have you right there at David McNicoll 1 on Facebook. So if you wanna scope him out, check him out, you do that. Dave, you're up.
I'm waiting for it. There it is. Okay, good. Hey guys, it's Yukon Dave coming from his basement. You can find me at Yukon Dave _EDM. And today I'm drinking, let me see if I can do this, my French Flair from the Single Malt Whiskey Society. It says it's lightly peated. I don't believe it, but it's really tasty.
What's 53, Dave?
53, 254.
Kalila.
No, Kalila. Perfect. Thank you.
Kalila. I knew you'd know that.
Well, I could trust some of us know it really well. I'll start with Drew and then Sheila. Alphabetic.
Yep. I'm Drew, at Drew Semper on all of the ones. I'm having Johnny Walker, the White Walker.
Why? Because it's snowing outside today?
Because it's snowing outside, and because the Johnny Walker was prominent in a bunch of the sections of the book, so it was, I'll go for that one.
It works perfect. Thank you very much. Sheila.
I'm Sheila Sepper, the other half of Drew's partnership. And I'm drinking Black Bottle because it was also prominently mentioned. Although I don't think the Black Bottle that's mentioned in the book is the Black Bottle of Modern Times that was in the oven. But I'm hoping that we'll maybe talk about that tonight. And I'm Ann Coney on all of my internet.
And Sheila, is it the old Black Bottle or?
No, it's the modern Black Bottle.
It's the modern one. Okay. I was almost really jealous because I've been looking for that old one for a while.
I'd love to get my hands on some old one, but Sean Kincaid seems to have found the master stash somewhere in Alberta and all of the old green ones.
All right. That's who we're going to have to hit up. Kent, you're up.
Hi, my name is Kent. The Cheryl part of me is not feeling well tonight, so it's just me single. Tonight I am drinking the Talisker Port Rouge, just because it's from the lowlands and many mentions of lowland distilleries.
Excellent, thank you. And last but not least, Nicole.
Hi, I'm Nick, you can find me, and I'm drinking Winter Storm, because, well, we have a winter storm going on right now.
Excellent. And it's perfect. And you know what? It's been a very long while since I tried the Winter Storm. I think it was a year and a half ago. It's been a while. So I don't need to hit you up for some because I've got some. I just have to find it back there. That's good. Everyone, I'm Dolph. I'm really, really happy you're here tonight, and it's really good to be back. We've had a 2-week hiatus, and it's now to get back on track, back to what we love, and it's talking about books. So let's welcome David. Welcome. I'm glad you're here. But David, with the intent of giving you an idea who's on the panel, I'm going to quote you directly. Oh, sorry, I got to take a clicker off so my students don't ever watch me in the future. And I need to get to, all right, here we go. So then there are those, hopefully that's the right one. Then there are those who are real enthusiasts with cupboards bursting with a good range and who love to go to tastings or are always on the lookout for something new. So my friends that you see beside us, I met most of these cats at tastings in the past 3 to 7 years. And these individuals are those that I can count on for a good whiskey because they, like me, have quite a bit of whiskey. And it always leads to good conversation. So I'm really happy to have all of you here tonight and Dave. So Dave's book was suggested to Sheila, and she dropped it off here about 3 months ago. So I'm going to pick on you right away, Sheila. Can you tell me what Drew and you saw in this book and why you suggested it to me to show the group? Right?
Well, right away. I will start with David, your class at the Brooklyn Blannery. I took it at the beginning of COVID times because we were looking for things to do. And we hadn't started all of our internal virtual whiskey tastings yet. So we were all desperately looking for things to do because we couldn't go out and do things. We were all just starting lockdown. And so there was no more tastings. And people were bored and looking for things to do. And I think one of the local whiskey shop owners had mentioned that you were running the course at the Brooklyn Blannery. So we signed up and then we learned about your book. So immediately I went out and bought your book.
Yay.
And the book club had just started. So I was reading the book and I think, Dolph, you had mentioned that you were looking for a book at the time. And your book was unique because it's not really heavy into the how of whiskey is made. It's not really into the chemistry, but it's really interesting because it talks both about a little bit about the history of some of the distilleries, but the history and the romance of Scotland, which I kind of like, and the regions, but it talks about little bits and pieces of everything. So you get a little bit of the language and the history of the language, the different areas of Scotland, little bits about the royalty, the crown, history in general. But it's also not a complicated history, so you're not, a complicated history. You're not dredging through a textbook trying to memorize numbers and trying to relate to which king or queen killed which king or queen.
Yeah.
Hundreds and hundreds of years. So you're not feeling like you're slogging through a very serious text. So I found it a very enjoyable read.
And the history part of it makes me exceptionally happy. So I'm a history guy. So thank you, David, for writing this book.
Well,
and thank you, Sheila, for suggesting it to us. And thanks to everyone for reading the book and coming on tonight. So let's do it. This book, here we go. This book, right. Another quote. I'm quoting you everywhere, David. This book is for you if you've ever been in a decent bar with a good range of whiskeys and wondered how to pronounce half of them, what the names mean, and what the origins of the famous and not so famous whiskeys that stand guard in the back of the bar. So, panel, I'm going to ask you a question, then Dave right after. We've all made the mistake in the pronunciation of a Scotch or two. Who taught you how to pronounce the various Scotches? And I'm wondering, do we have someone that's helped us a lot, or do we just learn along the way when we've embarrassed ourselves in tastings and something? Anyone want to jump in on that? Who's helped you the most?
Sure. I listen real close to the brand ambassadors. I keep quiet till I understand what they're talking about.
Okay.
Because I can screw up things easily. So.
Well, we all have. And how long did I say Islay? Oh my God. And it was an embarrassing moment at a tasting, but I learned, right? How about you, David? Was it mom or dad that taught you?
I guess it'd have to be. I mean, there's no individual for me. It's you grow up with it. But believe me, you're not in a minority either in Scotland. There's plenty of people who can't say Isla in Scotland either. There's plenty of Islays out there, but I think the one that everybody gets stumbled on is Glenmorangie. That's that's the go-to faux pas. I think is that you get the Glenmorangies out there, but I guess I don't speak Gaelic, but I'm a Gael who speaks English with a Gaelic accent, if you like. Okay. And my grandparents had Gaelic about them, and most of the whiskies are Gaelic based, and we have a lot of place names that are very similar to what the whiskey names would be. So there's a village just down the road from where I grew up called Ballyvullen, which is the village with the mill. So it's not a big leap of imagination to go from Ballyvullen to Lagavulin. Yeah. And so on. I guess in a way to sort of tail wag the dog on that is my advice to anybody who's setting up a distillery in Scotland who looks to try and get a global reach for their product is perhaps not to go down the road of almost unpronounceable. I remember sitting in a room with the American Scottish Foundation in New York where the guys from the new distillery on Harris were presenting to the board to try and get some fundraising going. And Harris Distillery is Nacherach, and there's a D in there, and there's an H in there. And I said to him, I was like, at the end of the day, who the hell is going to be able to pronounce that? It does not. It's not phonetic. And I guess somebody living on Harris is going to be okay with that. But, you're looking at a bar in Chicago, New York, London, whatever. It's going to be tricky. And nobody wants to make a fool of themselves. So I always say to people, it's like, why do you think Macallan's so successful? People can say it. I mean, when you assailed by Bruichladdich and Bunnahavens and Kalilas and, Dalwaniers and so on, no one's going to there and going to go, I'll have an Oban. And even Oban's a tricky one. It's Oban, not Oban. So I guess I grew up with it. It's from cradle to grave. I guess if I can't, then we're all in trouble.
Lecheg was another one for me.
Which one?
You read Lecheg as Ledeg, right?
Ledeg.
Yeah.
Lecheg.
Ledeg. Yeah. The D is like Duke, like not D and duck, but G, like J. Ledeg.
How about Nick? Who helped you out? Or was it just the same thing, going to so many tastings that we just kept hearing it over and over from the brand ambassadors?
Yeah, going to tastings, getting the brand ambassadors, and then when you travel to Scotland, the first time you missay it, they correct you quickly.
Oh, yes, we do. Well, but the thing is, it's not aimed for you guys. We do it deliberately. I think we do place names deliberately just to confuse English people. There's a village on the Black Isle which is spelled Avoch and it's pronounced Och. So,
really?
Yeah. I mean, you even take my name, David, in Gaelic. It's Daibhidh, and you pronounce it Die. Why use two letters when 8 will do?
Yeah.
I think, and we love to see gods with feet of clay. So people who can't pronounce stuff is usually pretty amusing.
It's just fun. And I'd be okay with that. I'd be in the bar and I'd mispronounce it and someone would correct me and I'd laugh and I'd mispronounce it again on purpose. It's good.
Well, once you've had a few, it doesn't matter what you're pronouncing. It all kind of sounds the same anyway.
Yeah. Perfect. And Drew, how about you?
Primarily her and her parents.
The Scottish background helps out, eh? It's good. All right. So I'm going to do another quote. Tons of quotes. I got it. So the idea here is to peel back the layers to find out the story behind the names, all against the backdrop of Scottish history, as the two are inexorably linked. Inexplicably linked. No, they're explicably. My wife's correcting me and she should stop. David, I
can't say, and I wrote that.
Page 2. We're ready to begin for the book. Page 2. After reading the first 3 chapters, could we not add the backdrop to geography as well? And that's your major in university, but you do focus on the geography. So can you link that for us?
I think the idea behind this was really there were several reasons for doing this. One, was to write a book that was different. I think you guys have said that, not to dive deep into the minutiae of flavor and profile and so on, which is very subjective anyway. But also, there's plenty of books out there on specific history, and you say this, as you say, such and such killed such and such in 1844 and 1936 and that kind of stuff. Was to kind of write a book which was history through a geographer's eyes. So I took, a geographer. We see geography everywhere. It doesn't matter where we're going. We're trying to figure out how that got to look the way it did, and the landscapes are. The place names on the landscapes are a window into the description of why that looked the way it was, which may not have been what it looked like, when we see it, but the way our grandparents saw it and way back is that, particularly those that come from the Gaelic language. Gaelic is a very descriptive language, so it describes the way people saw something or interpreted it in a way that was a land use that we don't use today, or it's redundant as far as we're concerned. So by mapping in space and time, we got a chance to look at that landscape. So it is history, but all of it in a way is partial to geography, and we have to be aware of that time as well. You can have two farms, and most whiskey distilleries have farm name origin, that you can have two farms that are side by side each other, but they were named maybe 300 years apart. So it's time and space. So that something that was named 1,000 years ago, which is still used today, may 300 years later the farm up the road was a different language. So we get to view a world that is lost, and it's I did a bit of this when I was at university, mainly with the towns, but I think it's a resource for looking at past land use and mapping of Scotland that that is underused, because Scotland doesn't look like it did 400 years ago. It really doesn't. Okay. So it's all geography.
It's all geography, and it's linked with the history, which is linked with the language, and we're really hoping to get through all of it. And in my mind, I want to link it all so that one can connect to the other, because as a history guy, there's always the economics that go with the history and the political background. So I'm thinking of that in the same kind of context where it's all going to feed into each other. All right. Thank you, sir. Let's go back to, we're right at the beginning of the book, and you talk about distilling 2,000 years ago in Egypt to distill water in order to survive. And I did have a quick question. Was that the first account of distilling was there in Egypt?
No, there's the origin of distillation as we would recognize, if we were going down the road towards where we get to, is really something that occurs in the Arabic world in the 8th and 9th century, particularly in places like the Alhambra and places like Baghdad and so on, where this golden age of Arabic reasoning is steps forward in mathematics and so on. But what the Arabs were doing, these alchemists and mathematicians and geometrists and so on, was that they were dealing with a lot of work that was coming out of, like, the Library of Alexandria, which was destroyed, with knowledge that was known within the Roman Empire and ancient Greek knowledge. So we know that Aristotle, and I prepared myself, so I have a quote. Aristotle actually said, seawater can be made potable by distillation, and as well as water, wine and other liquids can be submitted to the same processes. So it was known in ancient Greece what to do. It's not rocket science. I mean, one gentleman describes how he's trying to work with mercury using what was clearly a rudimentary still, and the condensation of water on the outside of the still was beginning to form droplets the further away from the heat you got, and then trickling back down. Well, that's basic distillation. Also, this is the earliest that I can find. There was a king in Mesopotamia, and here we go with pronunciations. King Zimlarin, we'll call him Zim. That's what I'm going with. King. If anybody wishes to correct me, feel free to do so. But he was a guy who was a king of Mesopotamia 3,700 years ago, and using what can clearly be described as something we know would be distillation. He was making, apparently, or his lackeys were making hundreds of gallons of balm and perfume annually. So distillation isn't just for making alcohol. It's a rudimentary alchemic formula. But the road to getting to where we want to go, to the fun stuff, really kicked off in the Arabic world, and then the knowledge then passing into the monastic communities of Southern Europe, particularly with the establishment of the medical college, medical school at Salerno near Naples in 1000 AD. So that would be your starting point in Europe, and then it goes. Alchemy kind of then dives in this direction until it becomes crystal balls and tarot cards, and then chemistry goes off in this direction, and then sort of the practical application, ends up here.
And when did they get it in Europe? Mostly because you said 1,000 years before, but or BC.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking 1,000 after with the Crusades. So that's a 2,000 years difference before it became more popular. Is there a point in time where it was more commonplace, where you're not looking for one single instance in the 1400s in Ireland or something?
Yeah, I think that what happens is once once it gets into the monastic world, I think the real trigger is once it's not just something that there are guys that are in their little caves within the monastic community fiddling about with this stuff. I think the trigger is the Black Death. This is from my opinion. I think that when you have half of a continent's population wiped out overnight, and the aquavita, which is the rudimentary alcohol that becomes spirit, the drinkable spirit, is the great medicine of the day. I think that with drinking that and not dying of bubonic plague, I think it spreads out at that point. Also, the monks needed these haircuts, their tonsures, and so they employed the barbers. So when we think of barber surgeons and the Sweeney Todd and all this kind of stuff, as a profession, they began life in the monasteries too. But then they ended up doing the business end of the hacking and splicing and dicing. Europe was at constant war in the Middle Ages, and so they needed alcohol to sterilize their equipment. And so I think that you get to that point in somewhere around between 1300 and 1400, it becomes ubiquitous across Europe, particularly in the Holy Roman Empire. Now, doesn't mean to say that you've got like one point of entry and that's it coming into Europe. I think you do have multiple reasons why it comes in. I think through the monastic communities 1,000 years ago, there's nothing to say that knowledge wasn't passing through Constantinople from like the Crusades. And also now we seem to be dialing back the detail and a lot of possible Chinese influence as well coming in through, again, through Constantinople. We know the Chinese now were distilling at least as early as the Egyptians were, possibly potable alcohol as early as the Arabs. So did that knowledge then pass along the Silk Road? It's not an avenue that people have generally thought about, but to me, there are multiple entry points. And I think it's the same with Scotch as well. I've never been a believer of the out of Ireland theory. I think the more likely theory is out of France.
Okay.
I think it's come through the Augustinians and the Cistercian monasteries. But because the monastic element in Ireland, is meant to be the monks of Ireland brought to Scotland, the monastic influence in Scotland from Ireland was gone by the 10th century, and alcohol wasn't available in Europe at that point anyway. So I think in the west of Scotland, trading with Ireland in the 13th and 14th century may have been that it did come in to the Western Highlands and Islands through a different route, but through to the main part of Scotland, my money is on it's coming through the monastic, and possibly trading with Flanders. There was a lot of trading going on with the Hanseatic League as well. So it's multiple entry sources. Naming and pinpointing the exact spot that you get it is, I think, a fool's
We're not
errand.
going to get that. Okay. Or probably never, ever going to at any point.
Will this be on the test?
Nope. This is not on the test.
No, you have to buy the
test.
sequel. The sequel.
Okay.
But you do have to plow through the history.
I like the history. It's good. And as always, when a commodity is seen to be valuable, it's taxed. So Scotland, part of the United Kingdom, was once tax exempt in relation to barley, but it doesn't last. So whiskey becomes heavily taxed. The people disapprove, and whiskey production and sale is forced underground. So this is going to go to the panel here in a second. So David states here, I got another quote. As always, I got tons of quotes right there. So The 18th century was the heyday of the smuggler, the illicit still and midnight shipments through the mountains. It was a game of cat and mouse, and one where the mouse inevitably retained or remained one step ahead. So I love it when the people, and we talked about this before, stick it to them, stick up for themselves, and stick it to the man. But this is the Scottish people sticking it to the British overlords at this point. I like that a lot. So panel, does this have the same feeling as our Canadian smugglers and rum runners? And David, I'll have you weigh in on it afterwards. But
yeah.
Let's go, panel. What do you think about that comparison to our smuggling? So they smuggled, we smuggled. Same,
Right.
Very much as we
Go
were
ahead.
I think
the rum runners, even right here in Alberta, southern Alberta, running through the mountains, going down into the U.S. for prohibition. We've learned from our first book even how pretty much every province is making whiskey for the prohibition and running it across the border. It was a huge game, and people got very, very rich off it, especially during prohibition.
But didn't our smuggling come because we weren't allowed to consume alcohol?
No, well, it
Versus-
no.
became due to the fact that the U.S. had prohibition. That's where most of our smuggling, we're smuggling it down to them, not vice versa.
prohibition.
But when
and war. Civil War helped too because they stopped production then, and we did that then. Nick, you were trying to say?
We had a former prohibition. It lasted for like 18 months. It didn't last long in Canada because we like our booze. I disagree. It wasn't Canadians sticking it to the man. It was Canadians looking to make money. In the Maritimes, you read a lot about the prohibition and the rum runners, and it's what sustained communities. You had people returning. You had young men returning from World War I. They had nothing to do. This was a way to make money and still have some of that action in their lives.
Okay. And it wasn't sticking it to the man, although I think it was still exciting. It was an exciting trade. It's still.
Well,
I'm sure those didn't pay taxes on that money either.
Yeah.
But we didn't have a unified police service that was looking at rum running and smuggling. We were relying on the Coast Guard, the U.S. Coast Guard, and the U.S. Border Patrol more so to watch it. It was only sort of later in the game that the RCMP got involved.
Okay.
Well, and down the East Coast, you didn't really have an RCMP either at that time. Not in the same way, because the RCMP was a Western thing. So down on the East Coast, when they're smuggling, they did have, like you said, you're relying on the Americans to catch you more than you're relying on a Canadian faction to catch you. And even in the extension of like what Nick was saying, as far as the Canadians were, they were doing it because they needed the economy and they needed to keep the communities going. I think in large part, in sections of Scotland, the same thing was happening. It wasn't so much that they were sticking it to the man, because they needed that money to keep the communities going. They needed to be able to export it out in order to be able to bring other things into their communities. They needed to keep the whiskey flowing.
Keep the whiskey flowing. It's like Dune. You've watched Dune anytime soon. Sorry. That's good. David, was it more of a business transaction, or was it sticking it to the man, a combination? What do you think?
Well, it's very deep and very complicated in a way. It's because there was a lot going on. A lot of the sort of rise of the taxation element came along the backdrop of the Jacobite risings, the Jacobite rebellions against the imposition of the Hanoverian monarchy, against the exiled Stuarts. But the Stuarts weren't exactly super popular in Scotland anyway, so there was a big difference between Lowland and Highland, city and town, and so on. The actual making of whiskey was about survival. It wasn't initially. It wasn't made to stick it to the man. It was done as a byproduct of the agricultural world. The Highlands of Scotland in the 17th, 18th century was subsistence. So subsistence farming existence, whereby the barley that you grew, and it can only be barley, and it wasn't even good barley, it was beer barley, which is not as good as the barley that we use today. There was really no other use for it, apart to make bread, I guess, and people paid their rent in it, but it would go moldy, so you made it into whiskey. and sold it, and those few shillings that you made could be the difference between making it through a winter and so on. So it was very much a part of the community. Nobody thought about it as being something, sneaky or something that you did that was, contraband. It was as simple as cooking a cauldron of soup. It was something you did. Everybody did it. And up until 1781, everybody could do it. Legal whiskey production, as long as it was for domestic reasons, was entirely legal, particularly across the Highlands. And landlords encouraged it because the landlords wanted their rents paid in money. They didn't want it paid in, eggs and cheese and such. So they encouraged it. In fact, in the heyday of the smuggling rackets, which became very much professional in the 19th century, the landlords turned a blind eye to it because people in jail don't pay rent. So it was really for the government to break down the institutionalized community element. But at the backdrop of that is you have the rise of professional whiskey making in lowland Scotland. So in lowland Scotland, you have huge distilleries, professional tax-paying distilleries emerging from the 1720s. In the Highlands, they were small-scale, tiny little, 12-gallon stills, that maximum 12 gallons. There was tax had to be paid on it if you were selling it to anybody. And that tax had gone back way before the Union of Parliaments with England. That had gone way back into 1644. But it wasn't a lot that had to be paid. There was one exception, which is a great story if you Google the whole thing out, called the Parentage Privilege. Duncan Forbes, who was the Lord Advocate of Scotland, had managed to do a deal with the King in 1690, again, prior to the Union of Parliaments, whereby after his lands had been harried, he would have tax exemption on all the whiskey he made on his property ad infinitum and in perpetuity for his children and children's children, and the government agreed to it. And so he built 25 distilleries on his estate. And by the 1780s, the man was producing 50%, or not him, but his grandson, was producing 50% of all the whiskey made in Scotland without paying a single dime of tax on it. So the Parentage Privilege lasted for 100 years, and as the government began to try and wrap its head around the whole business of what was becoming a business, the Parentage Privilege had to be dealt with as well. So there was a lot of moving parts. There was professional distillation taking place. There was Joe Schmo up in the hills making his stuff. There were people who were running that into the lowland cities. Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee were getting big. These cities were growing. There was an agricultural revolution, so there was a lot better barley, more source, more people. It was a very fluid time, and then in the backdrop of that, you've got the Jacobite risings and this sort of constant state of warfare in the Highlands. And the sticking it to the man element kind of comes at the tail end of that, because by stealing from the king, by not paying his taxes, it was a victimless crime. Of course, that's how they saw it. So you were snubbing the king by not paying his taxes, by smuggling under the nose of the excise officers who were out there. Now, even by 1800, the cost of policing the Highlands was less than the revenue generated from it. So it wasn't worth doing it. And certainly by 1800, the Highlands of Scotland, it had become very sophisticated. You had the farmer, the blacksmith, you had the landlord, the factor on the estate, and you had smuggling gangs, maybe 30 or 40 strong, probably Irish, mostly Irish or Glaswegian, who would then pick stuff up in the hills. They would transport it down to the outskirts of, say, Glasgow or Edinburgh. They would sell it to the bootleggers. They would sell it to the end user. The end user was probably the children of the people who were making the stuff, because they were the summer migrants coming into the city. So everything was very tied together. But it became this idea of hiding stuff in the mountains and sneaking it away, snubbing the king's officers was seen as a token gesture of defiance in a mountain area that was known for its indefatigability. And it's sort of Custer's last stand, if you like.
It's a very romantic thing, to tell you the truth. For me, maybe some people think.
Well, that's what the guy, the Johnny Walkers and the Tommy Dewars of this world, they bought into that at the end of the 19th century, so the end of the 20th century, and so on, or the 19th century, in their marketing. It really was posters in the tube in London of a hairy Highlander standing on a rock with his kilt flapping in the wind and a bottle of Dewars White Label, and he's defiant against the government. We all like to be defiant against the government, so
I think it's fantastic. We're going to enter into a bit of a program because this history kind of intertwines with this history. And this was the first book that we did. It was Davin's Canadian Whiskey, a Portable Expert, David McNicoll, and he was our first guy. So we always refer back to him. He's got a place in our heart. And so we're going to kind of add that into this segment, if that's okay. So as in Canada, and I've got a quote as well. A quote right there. So a quote. As in Canada, there's bigger players that could front the duty payable and invest openly in new techniques that would ultimately improve the quality of the product. Bowmore, Oban, which I have here tonight, Oban, and Highland Park, for example. So, panel, this question for you. Could we say that Gooderhunt and Ward, Seagrams, here in Walker, they parallel Bowmore, Oban, and Highland Park? Now, it's not the 1800s. It's like 1867, 1870s, 1880s for us. But the same money limitations for the little guy, right? Do we think it's about the same thing? I'll
very
open
much.
it up.
Yeah, very much parallels. Just a century later, almost. Oh.
Yeah. Well, it's definitely, from what Davin said, that basically wiped out all the small guys here in Canada.
yeah, I can believe it.
I even have a quote for that one too.
Oh,
there we
geez,
go.
you would have.
Age requirements were hard on the small producers. And this is a Davin quote, though. We're most likely to evade tax. Within a couple of years, not a single nuisance distiller remained. So it did get rid of them. But it was the government that wanted more taxes, right, at that point. And David, is it the same thing? The government wanted a lot of taxes, but they're trying to get rid of people. I'm wondering, where was the balance for them? How did they figure?
Well, I guess that there's an elephant in the room whenever you're talking about Scotland, and that, of course, is our neighbours to the south. I think we all have to deal with an unruly neighbour to the south. Yeah. You guys must think you're living above a meth lab. But I think it was a Canadian Prime Minister who said it's like being in bed with an elephant. Well, Scotland's in the same boat. We're in bed with an elephant as well. And England has a part to play, not from a nationalistic point of view, but it does have a part to play in almost that narrative we were saying, was that I mentioned that there was big professional distilleries in the lowlands of Scotland. Yeah. Now, these distilleries were producing a lot. I mean, we're talking over 1 million gallons of juice. Someone like Oban in 1790s were producing maybe 30 or 40 gallons in a month. So it was David and Goliath. Yeah. But the Highland distillers really didn't venture on the radar to the big lowland distillers. And there was two families that intermarried. It was almost like 7 brides for 7 brothers. These were the Haigs and the Steens. And the Haigs and Steens effectively created a monopoly. Now, in 1783, William Pitt becomes the Prime Minister, and he's left with this massive deficit. The British had taken on a bunch of farmers on the east coast of America and lost. And they were left with this big hole in the bank balance. So Pitt had to do this. Now, William Pitt loved nothing more than book balancing. And he was able to streamline the East India Company. He was able to streamline smuggling into the UK of things like tobacco and sugar. And he turned his attention to Scotland. And what he did was he wanted to tax the lowland distillers very heavily. And he wanted to tax the Highland distillers very lightly to encourage them to come out of their shell. And so there was 2 different tax brackets were created. But these massive distilleries, Kennet Pans and Kilbaggy, the stuff they were producing was toxic. It was firewood. Because the principal reason for making this stuff wasn't to be quaffed in some fancy tavern in Glasgow, like Saracen Head or something like that. The government was taxing you on capacity of still, not how much you produced. So the quicker you could run your stills, the more you made, but the quality goes down the toilet. And so the big distilleries, instead of taking, say, 72 hours to run a batch, Lochrin and Edinburgh were running. They were recharging the stills every 12 hours. And so they were firing this fire water through, but they were selling it to England. They were selling it to the rectifiers in London to turn it into gin. Nearly half of all the gin consumed in London in the 18th century was made in Scotland. So the Steens and the Haigs and the Balds and the Phillips, these guys in lowland Scotland, they were selling huge amounts down to the rectifiers in London, competing against the big London distillers. So the big London distillers, who had been, their own industry had been stymied by the Gin Acts, the laws against gin making in London, but they were recovering, but they had the ear of the politicians in Westminster. And so the law, the taxes that hit the lowlanders were really hard, because you were trying to slow down the amount coming out of Scotland, but also Pitt needed the money. So this was really when you start to see that division between the Highlands and the Lowlands.
I need you to clarify this for me, because the Hagues, that's Cameron Bridge, and it's grain. Yeah. They have the coffee stills, and that doesn't produce that much. I thought, no, it produces tons, just not in that small quantity of time. I thought
not anymore, because they weren't using column stills back then. They were using pot stills.
Got it.
So Robert Steen is the inventor of the patent still, but unfortunately Robert Steen's stills kept exploding. So Anus coffee stills were introduced instead. And so in 1824, John Hague introduces the column still at Cameron Bridge. So Cameron Bridge today makes more grain whiskey than all the Islay distilleries put together combined do for malt whiskey. But back in the day, they were running. I mean, Kennet Pan's distillery, which is halfway between Edinburgh and Glasgow, employed 300 people, and which was pre-industrial Scotland, and it was the first business in Scotland to have a Watt steam engine. It was James Watt from Greenock, to have a James Watt steam engine involved for grinding the grain, and they had their own harbour and so on. They were essentially a town all by themselves, and they were producing, that one distillery alone was producing 1.2 million gallons a year to go to the English market.
All right. It's a lot.
And today it's a ruin.
Is it?
Yeah. None of the Lowland distillery industry collapsed because of William Pitt.
Oh, and we're going to hear about that more later. Are we not? I think. Okay.
Foreshadowing.
And we do like that. We're going to do another Canadian parallel. So this time with the 1823 Excise Act, which removed the unpopular taxes, and for a fee of £10, I think he said, no, I know exactly, because I've got a quote. Remove the unpopular taxes, and for a one-off fee of £10, distillers could operate legally. So Glenlivet, Jura, Glen Grant start up, and I love Glen Grant. We have a tasting of Glen Grant in 2 weeks, so I'm just throwing that out there. I'm trying to say that they're a lot like Alberta distillers and Black Velvet, who weren't, for us in Canada, weren't able to show their heads, really emerge until the 70s, and in Alberta specifically, when we gave them 1946 government subsidies helped them out. So it's the same type of thing, I think. Panel, are you okay with that? To try to say that? £10 as opposed to a government handout's pretty well the same thing?
No. I don't think paying up $10 is the same as the government handing out money.
No.
Yeah, £10 seems a little bit light compared to government money.
Yeah.
Well, it was 46. I'm not sure how much. So, David, I'm going to ask you this. So tell me a bit about this act. So the Excise Act, was it out of the goodness of their hearts, or another reason why they removed the taxes? Or again, it was just an extension of trying to, what they were doing for the North, bringing it down?
Yeah, I think the 1823 Excise Act, and there's also an 1822 Distillers Act, legal Distillers Act. So there's a carrot and stick. The 1822 Act, one of its key elements said to the landlords, if illegal distillation is found upon your estate, you will be liable for fines as well. And suddenly it didn't become just as profitable for the landlord to have whiskey made on his estate. But then the carrot was that your fee would be £10. And rather than this onerous amount of taxes. I think the success of the thing took everybody surprised, the government included. They'd spent 40 years throwing stuff at a wall to see what would stick, and nothing had. And then suddenly, out of the blue, this did work. And it began with William Pitt with the Wash Act of 1784, which creates the Highland-Lowland division. And it was just his inability to reconcile the irreconcilable stuff. He just couldn't square pegs and round holes. And so there was lots of different laws that came through. and they tried every trick in the book. But what happened was that as you're getting towards the 1820s, the whiskey industry, particularly in the Highlands, had got to a stage where having legal distillation was to a certain extent viable. But the problem was that your encouragement to go legal was somewhat stymied by the fact that the guy down the street was making his with impunity, illegally, and not paying any taxes. So when we think of sticking it to the man and the excise officer and so on, actually to the legal distiller, the excise man was a friend. He was able to root out those who were making illegal whiskey because they were the competition that he couldn't compete with. But what happened with the 1823 Act was, it really is an unusual thing, was in 1822, King George IV visited Edinburgh. Now, George IV was the first reigning monarch of Scotland to set foot in Scotland since 1651. And it was razzmatazz central. The whole of the city was bedecked in tartan. Everybody was dancing around pretending they were Rob Roy. And the whole thing was choreographed by Sir Walter Scott. So Walter Scott was the most famous man in the world in 1822. And he invented romantic Scotland. And so everybody was in sashes and kilts and all the rest of it. Half of it he invented. Half the tartans you see he created. And all of it was for this wonderful regalia for the king, and he himself dressed in a kilt and all the rest of it. And when he arrived into Edinburgh and he was taken up to the palace, he asked for a whiskey, and he specifically asked for a Glenlivet. Now, Glenlivet is an area. Glenlivet is what I'm drinking. Glenlivet is a valley, the Glen meaning valley of the River Livet, the valley of the smooth running water. And there wasn't a distillery in Glenlivet that was legal. So here was the king asking for a whiskey that was from a distillery that was flaunting his laws and not paying his taxes. And people fainted. But in the crowd, as the carriage is heading up to the Palace of Holyrood House, awaiting the king's arrival, there was all these guys dressed in feathers and all that, was Alexander Gordon, the Duke of Gordon. And the Duke of Gordon owned Glenlivet. He owned 250,000 acres of the Highlands of Scotland. Okay. And so many illegal distilleries on his land. And here was the king endorsing it. The king was putting his royal stamp of approval. And at exactly the same time as this was going on, there was a commission by Lord Wallace in Parliament on the excise in Great Britain and Ireland. And so the Duke of Gordon, who was a member of the government, lent very heavily on the Wallace Commission. And so the 1873 Act was passed, with the Duke of Gordon basically drafting it so that legal whiskey could be made on his estate, so his land and his tenants could pay him legal whiskey. And one of his tenants, George Smith, in 1824 got the first license, and that's Glenlivet. So it really is, and because of that, and because it was so successful, it took everybody completely by surprise that no one had expected this. And so hundreds of distilleries suddenly appeared on the line. I haven't been doing this for 20 years. I've just started yesterday. And that the sort of that law of unintended consequences was it created hundreds of single malt distilleries. And while, if you pardon the pun, that was distilled down to about 150 within a decade, it gave the Scotch industry this broad base of flavors, of a real flavor spectrum, which the Irish industry didn't have, as it was consolidating around Dublin and their like Jameson's and so forth. Whereas the Scotch industry became very broad based, and when that was really the palate that the Dewars and the Johnny Walkers and the Chivas brothers and Teachers and Jimmy Buchanan, the what they call the whiskey barons, the great blenders, they now had this sort of sweetie shop that they could pick and choose from to create the blends that they had. But that would not have been possible without 1823. There's a lot that's not possible without 1823. It's a light in the sand.
That's a great date. We should celebrate it somehow. Some type of drinking.
In approximately 3 years, we should have a massive celebration.
I think I will. I'll plan.
Not for 3 years of planning, though.
Yeah. Oh, I can plan the heck out of anything. I'm good. Dave, again, I love the history component of your book. So another question that came to mind was prompted when you were referring to Glasgow and Edinburgh doubling in size from like the 1820s to World War I. So in 100 years, they doubled. And I'm just wondering, if Montreal and Toronto or New York and say Chicago kind of doubled at the same rate. So these are the thoughts going in my mind. So I'm going to throw this up to everybody. I wonder if they all had the same competition problems like you were talking about with water sources being used by the big industry and big industry contaminating the water, because they're all on the water. So Edinburgh on the water, New York on the water, Toronto on the water, Montreal, but they did have to compete for water, I think. So David, can you give me an example from New York? I know I'm putting you on the spot. Is there something like that was happening?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, probably Edinburgh and Glasgow, for anybody who's familiar with the two cities, there's no two chalk and cheese cities that you'll find. They're only 50 miles apart, but you couldn't find two completely different trajectories for cities. Edinburgh in 1790s, going into 1800, Edinburgh was the biggest city in Scotland and had been since the Middle Ages, but it had all been crammed cheek by jowl along the Royal Mile linking the castle to the palace. So you had 30,000 people crammed into one street, and the buildings were 14 stories high and made of wood, and they fell down with monotonous regularity. And it just didn't get beyond the city walls until the Scottish Enlightenment and the age of David Hume and Adam Smith and so forth, and the new town is built. But Edinburgh isn't actually on the water. Edinburgh's up on the hill. It's Leith that's on the water, and today the whole city spreads down into it. But Glasgow is built on the Clyde. Now, the great port of Glasgow is the Broomielaw. That's where, talking from a Canadian point of view, the great emigrations to Canada, certainly in the early 20th century and after the First World War, the great ships were leaving the Broomielaw in Glasgow laden with people. And as they turned down into the Firth of Clyde towards the Irish Sea and the Atlantic, they went past a very small island, and it's still called Canada Hill, because that was the last thing that anybody saw before they reached Canada as they left Scotland. And that's as you leave out of Glasgow. But the draft of the River Clyde at low tide is only 15 inches at the Broomielaw. Oh. So so they had to dredge the city, dredge the river deeply. By 1900, 2 out of every 3 ships sailing the world's oceans was built in Glasgow. It was the greatest shipbuilding city on earth. So you had best part of 1.8 million people crammed around the city of Glasgow. And it had made its money on sugar, it made its money on tobacco, it made its money on cotton, and it became a very wealthy city, but then it became a great industrial city. It's surrounded by coal fields, it's surrounded by iron ore deposits, it's sitting on the Clyde, it's a week closer to New York than London is, but water was a massive problem. So when cholera hit Glasgow in the 1830s, 5,500 people died of cholera. And then it came along a few years later, 4,000 people died. So something had to be done. And so about 30 miles north of Glasgow, in the Highlands, there's a lake called Loch Katrine, and they dammed it, and they raised the level by about 20 feet, and then they put pipes from Loch Katrine all the way down into Glasgow, and that today is still Glasgow's water supply, and it goes 30 miles from Loch Katrine to Glasgow without any pumping. It's all done by head of pressure, and so you've got this beautiful, clean, fresh water from the Highlands coming all the way down into Glasgow. And when Queen Victoria switched the system on, the year later, cholera came back and 30 people died. It was, but as the pipes come down the hills of Kilsyth into Glasgow, past some of the now suburbs of Glasgow, there's another pipe detaches from it, and it goes through the hills and it goes down into Clydebank, which is again now a big suburb of Glasgow, and into Auchentoshan. So Auchentoshan is the distillery we think of today for Glasgow, but its water comes straight from the Glasgow water supply from Loch Katrine, all done by head of pressure. So yes, there were once upon a time 40 distilleries in Glasgow, but it was, the water sources were just grim.
Okay. And I was wondering why Sheila was laughing in the background as you were telling this story, but now I understand. That's their favorite distillery. They have great stories of their tours when they went there. So
I was the brand ambassador in New York for 2 years for Auchentoshan.
Well, no, my dad was in Fiji. So my mom is from Port Glasgow, so that area of the country I know quite well.
Okay, yeah. Well, no, it used to be when I used to do the tour guiding thing, Auchentoshan was not didn't have a visitor center, but you could visit the distillery if you phoned in advance and you said, "Listen, I've got 8 people coming to Glasgow, blah blah blah. We'd love to see a distillery," and so a triple distilled as well. It's different, so you'd have to be by appointment, come in, but there was a sign. And they would they sent you a thing to tell you how to get there. And it was turned right at the crematorium and left at the cemetery. And you're like, people are clearly dying to get there. They've improved their signage somewhat since then, but yeah, you still get the feel of going into an industrial plant rather than one of those sort of wispy Highland distilleries like Dalwhinnie or something like that.
Something like that. Okay, that's good. And I'll save the question. I've got another question on top of another question, but we're going to stop. Just for further information for Canada, Montreal had Molson's, which was a distillery then. And in Toronto, we had Corby's and Goodrum and Warts. Same problems, but not nearly as much with the water. So there was contamination, but I don't think to the same extent. They're growing cities, but they're not nearly the same size, I'm guessing. And
my great grandfather lived in the Gorbals in Glasgow, and you were talking 110,000 people per square mile.
Wow.
Okay. It was the worst slums in Europe. It was 14 people. Apparently, according to my grandfather, when he went into, because he came from the sticks, he was a country boy, came into Glasgow to work in the ships, and he got into this tenement, and he said, "So where's my bed?" And the landlord just got a bit of chalk out and drew a rectangle on the floor. "That's you, son." That was it. And I think it was like 40 families to a latrine.
Oh wow. Okay. And you can understand why people get sick in that type of situation.
Yeah, you wonder why the life expectancy was 35.
Yeah. You got to move away. David,
ale and whiskey.
I'm going to go back. I was going to skip over it, but you worked or you owned. It was called. I'm trying to think of the name. Scottish Roots.
Yes.
And you had a second one as well. I think you had two different businesses there. Did you not?
Yeah, I grew up in a tiny village, and I worked at Blair Athol Distillery, but I was fed up dating my cousins, so my uncle, dad, and my auntie, mum. So I moved to Edinburgh, and I worked in the travel trade, and I set up Scottish Roots. I thought I was being awfully clever and very, very pithy by calling it Scottish Roots, because people would search their ancestral roots. I was going to aim for the American audience, which Americans call it routes. So that was the kibosh on that. But when we moved here, and my wife's from Minneapolis, so she's American anyway, and we came here, and I started working in the whiskey industry, but we still had a residue of the travel business, so we still own it. It's called Vacation Scotland.
Oh, nice.
So I use friends who still have businesses back home, to do the logistics, but we do specialize a lot in basically whiskey tourism. So I was spending 2 weeks out of 5 on Islay and another week in Orkney, and I was visiting a lot of distilleries, but as the designated driver.
With the big band. Well, I'm sure you had your opportunities too.
Yeah, one or two.
And
we know where you're going to get our next tour from, right?
I think we can go through you, David, and the ancestry component to it. So adding that to the whiskey I like the combination. I really, really, really do. Ladies and gentlemen, we've done our time. Only halfway through the questions I prepared for tonight, and we're at 58 minutes. So
sorry if I waffled then.
No, this is perfect, and this is what we want. And David, this is our whole intent. We end up with 100 viewers or 100 views at the end, but what we get is our time with you and getting to pick your brain on very specific elements. This makes me happy. There's no other way I would rather spend my Saturday night. I've got to tell you.
Well, I appreciate that. It's awesome.
Especially a Saturday night where there's what do we got? About 8 inches of snow today,
and it's just piling up. So
that's real dram weather. That.
Yeah.
And more after this. So that's all the time we have tonight, ladies and gentlemen. It's been a fantastic evening. So thanks to you, our listeners. Thanks to our fantastic panel. Dave, Drew, Sheila, Kent, Cheryl in the background, Nicole, David. It's been an absolute pleasure spending this time. And I hope you had as much fun as I did. So as always, here we go. Hold up our glass. Here's the good company. Here's the good whiskey. Here's the good books. And here's the good conversation. And here's to seeing you all next week, Saturday, November 14th, for our Whiskey Book Club's 5th and 2nd edition of this book right here. Let's get it up. The Language of Whisky with author David McNicoll. We get a good picture of that. That's good. And as a final note, if you don't want to miss a minute of future episodes, click on like, click on subscribe button, and we shall see all of you then. So we're going to end the broadcast, but cheers, everybody.
Cheers. Slanger.
Cheers.
Right.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
It's been a good night. It's still not done. We're still on live. We'll just keep drinking.